Ginger certainly crosses a lot of boundaries in her work, and so that's entirely appropriate. She has a long and distinguished career, including a time as the chief of the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Federal Trade Commission. Is that right? Or the right? And she's also has well known for her work on with Phil Leslie on hygiene and grades, and she has also a range of work across a lot of topics. And she and I had conversations about GDPR just recently, and here she is now with work about Alibaba and how it does its organization and runs its network. So we're happy to have Ginger Jin. And the one thing to say to everyone is feel free to ask her questions, or she'll pause for questions as well. And we'll try to, and she says she'll try to leave some time at the end as well. So take it away, Ginger.
Thanks so much, Shane. It's great to be here. This work is joined with Zhentong Lu, Xiaolu Zhou, and Lu Fang. And Zhentong is at Bank of Canada, and Xiaolu is at Xiamen University, and Lu Fang is an employee at Alibaba. Zhentong, Xiaolu, and I were consultant for Alibaba Group during part of the research, but none of us are consultant for Alibaba right now. This paper only reflects opinion of our own, not the opinion of Alibaba Group or any other organizations. This actually is the very first time we're able to present this work in the public domain, so we're really eager to hear your comments, suggestions, or criticisms. I will try to stop periodically for your question, but feel free to raise your question at any time, and feel free to unmute yourself, just speak up. Okay, can everybody see my slides okay? Thank you. Whoops, I have a trouble moving the slide, okay. Let's see. Okay. We know the relationship between brand manufacturer and retailer has always been complicated. It's become even more trickier if you consider the fact that more and more people are shopping online and they switch freely between online and offline channels. This brings a lot of opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the online marketplaces allow brands to reach probably a large crowd of people that they couldn't reach before. This is probably why over 150 luxury brands have agreed to open official store at Alibaba's Tianmao luxury pavilion. However, on the other hand, a lot of luxury brand has very mixed feeling about online marketplaces. And not only do they try to refuse to sell at those marketplaces, they even seek legal help so that the other people cannot sell their products on online marketplaces as well. So for example, here I'm showing you the news from the court decision at European Justice Court. They basically saying that luxury brands have the right to stop third-party sales of their brands on Amazon. And I don't think the US laws have the same position on this, but you can see that's the different brands would have different feelings about how they should sell or not sell their own brand product at online places. And you also have brands like Nike. They started relationship with Amazon in 2017, but after 2 years, they decide to end that relationship. So with all these anecdotes, we can see that the brand manufacturers and online marketplaces probably have very different perspective about the business here. So that's basically the point of this paper, that we want to understand how brand manufacturer and online platform differ in their economic perspectives. In particular, we want to understand what happens when a brand opens a flagship store on an online marketplace. We want to decompose that impact to the brand, to other sellers on the same marketplace, to the online platform that runs the marketplace, and to consumers. You would imagine the impact could be different by those different players. We also want to simulate whether the flagship entry, if accompanied by some restriction on other sellers, would have different impacts. To my best knowledge, we're not aware of such restriction for flagship store entry in Alibaba, but we have seen such restriction of other online marketplace. So we want to just ask hypothetical question: what if the flagship entry is also comes together with some restriction on other sellers? How would that affect the platform, affect consumers, and affect different sellers on the marketplace? So I probably should stop here for any question or initial thought you may have.
Yes, Ginger, how are you thinking about the trade-off? Because the way I think of it is sort of short-term benefits versus long-term costs of giving more bargaining power to the online platform that now is an intermediary between you and your customers. And if that's the trade-off, long-term versus short-term, how are you planning on measuring that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not sure that we will speak exactly to the short-run versus long-run trade-off, but we're going to speak to probably mostly short-run trade-offs, but in the following sense. The marketplace would allow the brand to access some consumers, right, especially those who feel comfortable shopping on the online marketplace. However, we have heard a lot of accusations from luxury brands, especially about, say, potential IP infringement by other sellers on the internet, potential existence of unauthorized sellers that do something either in pricing or non-pricing regimes could undermine the value of the brand. It may hurt the brand of hurt the image of the brand if some brand, like luxury brand, can be accessed in every place, not just in this exclusive channels fostered by the brand itself. So there are a lot of this kind of considerations going on. And later on in a few slides, I hope to flesh out some basic economics. And you can see that's sort of different players in this landscape would have very different considerations, and that's sort of exactly what we want to sort out in this setting. Okay, everybody okay if I move on? Okay, so exactly what we do. We use Alibaba's proprietary data from one particular category. We're not allowed to tell you exactly what that category is, but the leading category in cosmetics, okay? And we're gonna estimate the demand and supply within this category. That system would include flagship stores, authorized sellers of same brand, potentially non-authorized sellers of same brand, as well as sellers of other brands, okay? We're going to do counterfactual estimations. We can simulate the welfare effects of a new brand flagship entry, okay? We can also simulate what we call extension in flagship entry if that flagship entry contract also have some restrictions on sellers. We're going to talk about different versions of restrictions. For example, you can ban the potential unauthorized sellers of the same brand, or you can ban all sellers, or you can sort of say you only keep the big sellers in this area and so forth. So hopefully I can show you different counterfactuals just to give you a sense of how the different counterfactuals would have different impact on different kind of players here. Okay, so just give you some background. Alibaba is actually the largest online marketplace in the world, at least in terms of user counts. It runs two what we call 2C marketplace. One is Taobao and the other is Taobao is a C2C platform. It's similar to eBay, as anybody can list anything there. It has very low entry costs. There are many small individual sellers. Tianmao is a B2C platform. It's a business to consumer platform. It has relatively higher entry costs. The sellers must be registered companies. They have to show their credential before they can register in Tianmao. From consumers' perspective, the two marketplaces are actually integrated in the PC app or in website app, so you can easily navigate between the two. So in that sense, we're actually going to consider both of them as just one big platform, okay? In terms of flagship store, we mean a brand would open a official store on Alibaba's Taobao, it's actually on Tianmao, exclusively sell its own products. Okay, so this is authorized. It's kind of like the flagship store from the brand. It's a direct sale from the brand, and people would have no doubt that this is selling authentic goods from this brand. Okay, and that's different from authorized resellers. So you could have somebody licensed by the brand, but they're still not the brand itself, right? So that's the difference between flagship store and that kind of authorized sellers. And of course, you could have potentially unauthorized sellers, especially individuals who purchase from some other channels of the brand and then try to resell the same thing in this place, right? And those might be unauthorized sellers from the brand manufacturer itself, but consumers may still view the products there to be authentic or not authentic. This is all sort of up to the consumer belief.
Ginger?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. What restrictions presently come with a flagship store in the design of the store? So are all flagship brands required to display their goods in the same formats? Is search controlled by Alibaba, or is the search function, are they allowed to modify it for their own needs? And a couple of the other key features, like over what does I would think that the scope of restriction there would be a big tension between Alibaba and its flagship brands.
Yep, that's a very good question. I think this probably, you can view that as a store in the store concept. I don't have the details, but I believe the flagship store, the brand would have discretion in sort of what kind of products to provide in the store and exactly how the store will look like. They may have some control on the search within the store, but I think online marketplace wide, if a consumer just get on Taobao or Tianmao app and say search cosmetics, I think that search engine algorithm still controlled by Alibaba.
Okay.
It's generic search, because that search would cover not only the flagship but also other sellers, right?
Yes.
And I would imagine this kind of sort of the control or lack of control probably would have some variation across different brands depending on the negotiation between the brand and the platform. We have no information on exactly how the contract looks like. So right now I'm viewing the Alibaba to be kind of a huge black box here. It's just from consumers' perspective, now this brand has a flagship store on Alibaba. How would that affect consumers' purchase behavior?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll move on. So just to give you some sense, this is a picture of Alibaba's GMV at the just a group of cosmetics. GMV stands for gross merchandise value. So that's basically the total merchandise value sold on the online marketplace, right? This, you can view that as kind of a total revenue, okay? And it's not the revenue to Alibaba, it's total revenue to all sellers. Does that make sense? Because Alibaba's revenue may just be a share as a commission from GMV. Okay, so this is normalized. What I meant to show you is that you can see the black real line is the GMV attributed to flagship stores. It grows very fast from 2014 to 2018, while the light blue dotted line is for Taobao sellers. Remember, Taobao sellers are individual sellers that not necessarily have registered company status. They actually account for quite a big fraction of GMV on the overall marketplace. And then the black dashed line is for Tmall, and these are the registered companies who sell on Alibaba platform, and they're more likely to be authorized. I mean, we don't know exactly whether they're authorized by the brands they're selling or not, but they're more likely to be authorized than the individual sellers on Taobao. Okay, so oops. Okay, so coming back to Chiara's question, let's think about the basic economics here, okay? Different players would have different perspective. Let's start from the brand's perspective, okay? If the brand opens a flagship store, it will have direct access to shoppers on Alibaba's platform, which could be a positive thing for the brand, okay? It may enhance the brand value. It allows the brand probably do some direct promotion on the flagship store within Alibaba's marketplace, which could be good for the brand as well. However, it's likely to cannibalize sales of Taobao and Tmall sellers on the exactly same brand, and depending on whether they are authorized or unauthorized, and also depends on sort of how much revenue the brand could gain from those sellers. They may have a positive or negative attitude towards the cannibalization effect. This could also steal sales from other brands on Alibaba's online marketplace. So that's from the brand perspective, okay? And then from the platform's perspective, having a flagship store from some well-known brand, it could attract more and potentially higher-end consumers to the platform, okay? So more traffic might be good for the platform, so that could be a good thing. And it may help or upset other sellers of the same brand, depending on how large the cannibalization effect would be, right? It could also help or upset sellers of other brands. And again, it would depend on sort of the market stealing effect and market expansion effect here, which could be plus or minus for the platform. And because the platform's revenue typically is a share of the total GMV, so this will be related to the bottom line of the platform as well, okay? And then finally, from the consumer's perspective, having a flagship store, assuming that does not come by with some restriction on the sellers, it would expand the choice set for consumers, which should be a good thing, right? It will definitely reshape the price competition, both within and across brands. It depends on how it goes. It may price go up, it may price go down. So that would be linked to certain consumer welfare. In the long run, it may attract or drive away other sellers. And again, those other sellers could be the same brand sellers, it could be other brand sellers, okay? And then overall, the consumers may find the platform more or less attractive as a whole, depending on how the choice set and the price and the variety of sellers would change. So you can see, like we have the positive and negative and mixed results even within a party's perspective, and definitely will be quite different perspective across different players. So we try to capture all of this potentially in the structural model. Shane, you have?
A question from your first major bullet about the brand's perspective. Are you anticipating and then going to model or think about differences between the small and the large brand, or established or unestablished, a new entrant? I'm not quite sure what exactly what dimension, but what I want to get at the difference that
yes,
from Nike's perspective, it's very different from them and someone who's just getting into the business.
Yeah, Alibaba's internal file actually classify brands into so-called prominent brand versus non-prominent brands. We don't know exactly how they define those two, but we're just going to take that indicator and we're going to show you that the effects actually are very different for prominent versus non-prominent brands.
Yeah, okay. That's plenty. Okay.
Yep.
Hi, Ginger. Can I interrupt you too?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, thanks so much for this. This is great. I was just curious from the platform's perspective. So what can the platform do, or what do they do maybe whenever a new store opens up a flagship store, or a brand opens up a flagship store? Because I imagine that they can actually do quite a bit themselves in order to affect some of the things that you have, I guess, in all three of these here. And I'm curious in terms of like how they make those decisions, what they do. Do they send out, a massive email notification to all their customers that, purchase in a certain category? Kind of what's the platform's role in opening a new store, flagship store?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, we don't know any details on that. As I said before, we're viewing Alibaba as a black box here, and how they sort of promote the new flagship store relative to existing stores, we don't know, unfortunately. I probably could ask and see if they can give me some answer, but we don't know anything right now.
No problem. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question, though. Any other question before I move on? Okay, so I will move on. Okay, so as you can imagine, this work relates to multiple literatures. It's obviously related to the IO literature about the demand and supply of differentiated products. It's also related to a lot of literature in marketing about multi-channel, multi-brand retail. Especially there's some literature about how brand manufacturer and retailer sort of negotiate with each other in this power struggle between the two parties. Okay, there has also been a literature talking about how a brand would manage multiple channels. For example, they could just sell through wholesale, or they could open their own store and get to the consumers directly, or they can do a mixture of those two. So there will be sort of a lot of marketing literature about how the brand coordinate between those channels, and also what's the nature of intra-brand competition given the existence of multiple channels. I guess another angle here is the brand could say, I'm going to have a physical store just selling my brand, versus selling to some retailer, that retailer also sell other brands. So you would have the intra-brand competition and inter-brand competition, could happen at the same location or the same time, or both. Okay, so that's that literature. And I also want to highlight a literature about store brand entry. You probably have realized that a lot of retailers, especially grocery stores, already have their private label items. And those are the items that produced by the retailer themselves. And a large literature in marketing shows that the entry of store brand have huge impact on national brand. However, that impact seems to concentrate in second tier national brands, while the premium national brands still sort of hold the ground, and some even raise their price. So conceptually, I think the store brand entry is somewhat interesting and comparable to Flagship entry. However, the store brand entry was motivated and initiated by the retailer himself, but the Flagship entry is operated by the manufacturer himself. So in that sense, they are different. And also, this is related to the literature about unauthorized sales. We know in theory, consumers may want to buy some counterfeits brand, even if they know they are counterfeits. And however, they're willing to pay some amount above the price of generic items, but below the amount of the authentic brand item for status or other reasons, okay? And there also has been some empirical work, for example, from Chen, talking about how brand manufacturers try to deal with such phenomena, right? That's, should they sort of try to stop that kind of counterfeit sales, or should we elevate their own products so that it's hard for the counterfeits to catch up, and so forth. So our work is sort of related to that, although we cannot tell whether the product from, say, Taobao seller or Tianmao seller are counterfeits or not. And we even don't know whether they're authorized by the brand or not. But at least we know that Taobao sellers are more likely to be individual, and Tianmao sellers are more likely to be registered companies. So in our counterfactuals, we'll see how the Flagship entry is going to have different impact on these two types of sellers. Okay. So just to move on, just give you some preview of our findings. Sorry, my anecdotes is still here. And what we find is most time the Flagship entry does benefit consumers because it increases product variety. It intensifies price competition, especially within brand competition. It improves consumer perception about the platform as a whole, and therefore expand the customer base. And if we put some restrictions on the sellers, at the same time of a new Flagship entry, and that restriction tends to reduce consumer surplus for exactly the same reasons, okay? If we turn to the firm side, we find very strong cannibalization effect, especially within the brand, okay? There are a mixture of business stealing and market expansion effect, and they tend to be very different across channels, and also by type of prominent or non-prominent brand. So we think our study highlights the potential conflict of interest between the brand and the flagships, between the brand flagship store and the platform and consumers. So different people would have different interests, and sometimes those interests do conflict. Okay, so let me move on. So let me give you some review of the data. This is proprietary data from Alibaba on this particular category A. We have price and quantity at the seller item months level. We follow Alibaba's classification of brand into prominent versus non-prominent brand. We observe some seller characteristics, like which channel they're selling and their ratings on the platform, but we turns out not using their rating data as much because we're going to have very extensive fixed effects, which tends to absorb those variables. And we also have the number of active users of Taobao apps, and that's used to measure the overall market size. Okay. We aggregate those data into seller brand months because it's hard to tell whether two products with different products ID, are they exactly same thing or they are slightly different because of different color or different package. It's very hard for us to make that judgment. So we consolidate items into the brand level. So this in the particular category. So thinking the observation to be seller, brand, and months, okay? And we're going to there are tons of brands on this marketplace. We're going to select the top brands, and together they account for 90% of the total GMV in this market. Okay, so we have majority of the market here, and this is in compliance with the data use agreements between Alibaba and different brands. Okay, so give you some sense about the price between Flagship store, Tianmao, and Taobao. Okay, and the black real line is for Flagship store's price index. Everything is normalized here, but you can see that relatively Flagship store sell at a higher price than all the other sellers. Okay, between Taobao and Tianmao, Tianmao sellers sell at significantly higher price than Taobao sellers, and that's just a very salient fact from the data.
Ginger?
Yes.
So I had a question that sort of relates to your last slide, but also the slides for it as well. It seems as if setting up this mall provides pretty strong incentives for an otherwise small seller who had maybe, or maybe a medium-sized seller in this case, who had low prices and say low quality. This arrangement provides very high incentives to move their portfolio products from low prices and low quality to high prices and high quality, so that they can be in the flagship, so that they can succeed in the flagship. Because if I understand where this is going, it will be very challenging to have a sort of low price, low quality good in the flagship, given the cannibalization, but it will be potentially quite lucrative to be a high priced, high quality. Right?
That's entirely possible, but the marketplace has such a big group of consumers. There are many different types, right? There would be sort of this high willingness to pay consumers who value quality, and the Flagship store could be catering to them. On the other hand, you could also have a lot of sort of price sensitive consumers, and they want to sort of get deals, right? And may not mind whether the product is itself authorized by the brand or not. So you have like a host of consumer types on this marketplace. It's not obvious to me that the Flagship store should always charge a very high price.
Oh, okay. So then another way, that's a great answer. Then can I rephrase what I think I heard you say? So consumers are not going to, as per this diagram, consumers are not going to sort themselves necessarily into high price categories, medium price categories, and low price categories based on which mall they, which part they go to. Because that was the impression I was getting from the way this was set up in this price index, that consumers would sort themselves, and that's not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily. Well, they may or may not, right? Depending on how they use the app. I think the app enable you to zoom into a particular seller if you want to by using filter or other functions. It also allow you to search platform wide on whatever thing you want to have.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. So that's for price. Okay, this is for total quantity. And you can see that the quantity sold by Flagship store has been increasing steadily over time. Okay, and the spikes here are for the Double 11. The Double 11 festival. That's like November 11th. That's kind of sort of similar to the Prime Day of Amazon. Alibaba every year would have kind of a festival on November the 11th to promote sales. Okay, that's what those positive spikes are. And the negative spikes, they are typically the Spring Festival. So that's the major festival similar to Christmas in the US, and people tend to buy less during that holiday. So that's kind of the typical seasonality going on here. But the point of this picture is trying to show you that the flagship store sales has been growing quite impressively over time, okay? At the same time, you can see the Taobao sellers in aggregate still account for a large share of the total quantity, but it's almost flat over time, okay? And then Tmall sellers sales are increasing, but not as fast as flagship stores. So that's for total quantity. Okay. I'm still not mastering how to turn the slides here. Okay, so this picture is trying to give you a sense of what's the fraction of brands that's already have flagship store in our data, okay? We separate prominent versus non-prominent brands, and you can see that the growth of flagship store within prominent brands has been quite impressive. It goes up from 20% at the beginning of 2014 to almost 80% at the end of our sample. Okay, the fraction of flagship store also grows impressively for non-prominent brands, but not as fast. That goes up from about little over 30% to somewhere close to 70%. So overall, over time, you see the increase of flagship store entry during our data period for the category we're studying here. Okay, I'll stop here if anybody have any question. Okay. Okay, I'll move on.
Sorry, Ginger, actually, I do have a question.
So, yes.
Oh, sorry. You may have mentioned this before, and I may have missed. Oh, can you hear me? Or? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks. Sorry. You may have mentioned this before. Sorry if I missed it. But how does the platform like approach the brands to get them to set up a flagship store? Like, or is it the platform that's going to the more prominent brands and saying, hey, like, you don't have a flagship store, I think it would be in your best interest, why don't you come, because they're going to get more revenue from that or so? Like, do you have any insight? I know you said they're a black box, but do you have any insight in terms of kind of the opportunities or the recommendations, if you will, for both prominent and non-prominent stores to open a flagship store in the first place?
Yeah. We don't have the representative story, but from the anecdotes I have heard, it probably goes both ways. That's from the platform perspective. If they want to expand the potential consumer base, right, they probably would have some preference that they would prefer some brands to open flagship store here more than other brands. But from the brand's perspective, some brands may be more eager to open a flagship store here, while others are more reluctant. So I would imagine we would see a mixture of both type of stories.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. Any other question? Okay, I'll move on then. Okay, so just to give you more sense of the magnitude here, okay? So I'm reporting you a summary table about the category we study by different types of brand, prominent versus non-prominent here, okay? We talk about different channels. It could be the flagship or Taobao or Tmall sellers. Here I give you some summary of the number of products, number of sellers, number of brands, and average price and quantity. Okay, so let me start by this. Okay, so this is basically say if we think the number of flagship store from non-prominent brand is N, for just our hypothetical purpose, imagine that N equal to 100. Okay. Actually, number will be much higher than that, but imagine that N equal to 100. And that means, if you look at here, that means in Tmall, that's registered companies marketplace, we have about 56 non-prominent brands sold by Tmall sellers, okay? But in Taobao, there are about 154 non-prominent brands, and this is higher than the end itself because there are some brands do not have flagship store, but still sold by Taobao sellers, okay? And if you just look at the count of sellers, for every flagship store, let's say n equal to 100, we have about 129 Tianmao sellers. So the number of Tianmao sellers is slightly higher than the number of flagship stores. That means the same brand could have multiple sellers selling, okay? And if you look at the number of Taobao sellers, they're way higher, okay? For 100 flagship stores, we'll have like 5,300 Taobao stores, okay? So the number of Taobao sellers is many, many times of the number of flagship stores and the number of Tianmao sellers, okay? If you look at the number of products, well, we define, you can think of products as the combination of seller and brands. That's even higher for Taobao, and that's because every Taobao seller could be selling multiple brands. Okay, so that's kind of the marketplace. If you look at the price of flagship store tends to be higher than the price sold by the Taobao seller or Tianmao seller on exactly same brand. Okay, and however, the quantity of flagship store is much, much higher than the quantity sold in Taobao and Tianmao per seller. Okay, so that's for the non-prominent brands. If you compare that with the prominent brand, if you look at this number first, if we think there are 100 non-prominent brands existing on the marketplace, then there are like only 10 prominent brands existing with flagship store on this marketplace. So the number of prominent brands is much lower than the number of non-prominent brands in terms of flagship sellers. If you look at sort of number of Tianmao sellers or number of Taobao sellers, the brands they're selling, they sort of follow similar relationship as what we have seen for the non-prominent brands, that you could have some comparable number of Tianmao sellers selling the brands as compared to the flagship stores, but the Taobao sellers is much bigger in the counts as compared to the number of flagship stores or number of Tianmao stores. And the products they're selling is even bigger number because a Taobao seller could be selling multiple brands at the same time. So this is the sort of landscape that you can see that it has a lot of intra-brand competition. It also have a lot of inter-brand competition. Okay, any question?
Okay, I had a question actually.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about the frequency of the price changes, like how dynamically the price changes over time, and I was wondering if the introduction of a flagship stores would kind of stabilize and soften that like frequency of price changes, or is there a way to look into that? Sorry, that wasn't clear.
No, that's a good question. Yeah, our data is at a monthly level. We would know how average price per brand, per seller changes over months, but we wouldn't know how they change within the months. We probably can ask. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Oh, by the way, I should mention that I should highlight more. That's if you look at here, the prominent brand has higher price than non-prominent brand, which is not surprising. And however, if you look at the price premium of flagship store of prominent brand, that's almost double of those price sold by the Taobao or Tianmao sellers on the same brand. So you can see that's the price difference between flagship and other sellers is bigger than the price difference of non-prominent brands. And that's probably because the brands are prominent, okay? So people may appreciate, may put more willingness to pay on the sort of authenticity or authorized items from the flagship store on prominent brands. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so how we think about this demand system, there are brand, there are channel, there are seller. Okay, so right now we're viewing it as a 3-level listed logit. A consumer would come to the marketplace, first make a brand choice, and they could have prominent brand, non-prominent brand, or the outside option. The outside option means not buying category A products from Alibaba platform. Okay, and then in second level, within the brand, they may decide, should I buy from the flagship store or from Tmall sellers or from Taobao sellers? If you decide to buy from Taobao sellers, for example, there are a lot of sellers in Taobao selling exactly same brand. You will choose which seller you're going to buy from. Okay, so that's the 3-layer choice structure. We have tried alternative structures, but they tend to be give us some non-intuitive results, like the nesting parameter is beyond the regular range, things like that. So that's why we settle with this structure. Okay, so the exact equation is we're thinking the utility function of the consumer depends on the observable characteristics of the product, where we define a product to be seller, brand, and year. Okay. So that's X. This X would include price, for example, would also include whether this channel is a flagship channel or Taobao channel or Tmall channel. It also includes whether your own brand has a flagship store on the platform or not, because that could change your perception about the quality of goods you're getting from a Taobao seller or a Tmall seller, okay? And then in addition to that, we may have some unobservable characteristics for this product, okay? And then we may have some logit error, and here the logit error is in this form because we're viewing this as a 3-level listed logit. So if you follow this utility function, we can translate it into a linear demand system where the dependent variable is just the market share of this product as compared to the market share of the outside good, okay? So that's this. We'll get back us to the utility function x beta, and then plus some extra terms. And those extra terms here is trying to describe the degree of substitutability at the brand level. So this one is showing how different channels are substitutable to each other within the brand, while this one is saying how different sellers are substitutable within the same brand and the same channel, okay? So with that, we can run the linear regression with a lot of fixed effects, right? And we actually can do even more generalized than the typical nested logit, because we can allow the lambdas to differ by, say, type of brands, for example, or type of channels. So I'm going to show you those estimates later on.
Ginger.
Okay. Yes. Yep.
I'm curious how you're handling shipping times and shipping prices. It seems to me to be pretty material in many Taobao marketplaces, because it can vary a lot because there's so many sellers and the country's so big, as you well know. Maybe it's less material for this particular category. I'm just curious how you think about it.
That's a very good question. We have, as far as I know, we have no information about the shipping speed or shipping service. I would imagine that service probably would be more standard for flagship store and for Tmall sellers than for Taobao sellers. There are so many Taobao sellers, they're individually run. They probably differ a lot in terms of shipping. And I know from Alibaba's perspective, they have their own sort of shipping logistic company, but they also allow the sellers to use other shipping logistic companies. So it probably depends a lot on sort of who the seller choose to use and how that affect price. But we have no information on that so far. That's a good question. Okay, so as I said before, the X includes The acts include price and the dummy of whether your own brand has a flagship entry in the Ali's marketplace. Okay, it also allows us to do the product fix effects. Okay, this actually absorbs tons of variations in our data, and we're able to do this because our estimation equation ends up to be linear. Okay, we also have year-months fix effects, and just to control for both the seasonality as well as the growth of the platform as a whole. Okay, and actually the year-months fixed effects is probably more important than the generic control of year-months, because if you're thinking a flagship store entry is going to enhance the overall perception of the platform, that's going to be absorbed by this year-months fixed effects. So later on, we're going to unpack this year-months fixed effects as a function of like number of prominent brand has flagship stores and the number of non-prominent brand has flagship stores and so forth. So we're going to sort of look into the year-months fixed effect to see to what extent the entry of flagship store has driven different perceptions about the platform. And in our data, as you can imagine, is very long tail, right? And we have a lot of sellers may not have stable sales. So our estimation focus on so-called safe products that do not have zero sales during the life cycle of their existence in our data. And this is follow a literature about the zero market share. And it's basically, you can only count on the safe products to give you reliable estimates of demand, because otherwise the zero sales could drive things quite crazy. And finally, you would imagine that the price might be endogenous and the market shares, the within brand or within channel market shares could be endogenous. So we're following the Arellano brand bound approach to define instruments. We actually allow the unobserved characteristics, the C here, to have a AR1 process here. So your unobserved characteristics of this month may follow from your unobserved characteristics last month. Okay, so allowing that kind of time dependence is important given sort of how prices have been evolved in our data. Is also important because it gives us a sort of a dynamic panel feature of the data. If we follow the Arellano and bound approach, that means we can use the lagged price and share as instruments for the current price and share. So that's basically what this is giving us on the instruments. We have also tried to use the typical BLP instruments. They turns out not working. The typical BLP instruments is maybe some summary statistics about market structure at that time in this category. And that turns out to be not working because this market has a very frequent entry and exit. It's using those BLP instruments actually give us, for example, positive coefficient on price. It's just not reasonable. So that's why we're not following that approach. Okay. So that's basically the structure of our demand system. And let me show you the estimates here. Okay, there are a lot of numbers. Let me try to explain the numbers here. Okay, let's look at the price first. Okay, so the price is negative. That's a good thing. Okay. However, if you look at the magnitude, you may notice that the log price coefficient is much bigger for Flagship than for the Taobao or Tmall sellers. Okay, a lot of individual sellers in Taobao probably mean the consumers are very easy to switch, and so they're very sensitive to price. It turns out the data tells us that it seems like the consumers' price sensitivity is the highest for Flagship stores. Okay, and probably because the Flagship stores have much higher price than other sellers, and that's persist for both prominent and non-prominent brand. So that's the coefficient for price. These two lambdas are showing the substitutability within the brand, but potentially across channel or within the channel. Okay, so if you look at this number BC first, this is saying we have multiple sellers within the same brand and within the same channel, how substitutable they are. This number is supposed to be between 0 and 1, and the closer it is to 1, the more close substitutes the sellers are within the brand and within the channel. Okay, so you can see the estimated number here is around 0.8 for prominent brands and about 0.5 and 0.6 for non-prominent brands. So that implies that sellers are indeed probably quite close substitute to each other within this brand and this channel. The number B here is trying to show how different channels being substitutable to each other within the brand. Okay, and we're able to estimate different lambda B for different channels. So for example, if you look at this number, this sort of suggests that the Taobao sellers for this brand does not seem to be a good substitute to other sellers within this brand. However, the Tmall sellers seems to be quite a good substitutes to other non-Tmall sellers in this brand, while the Flagship is a clear sellers in this. So how to get those numbers? I guess my read is that probably the Tmall and Flagship stores are pretty close substitute to each other. However, Taobao is a different animal there. Even you're talking about within the same brand, and that's probably because the kind of products sold by the Taobao sellers could be very idiosyncratic, even if within the same brand, right? It could be different package size, it could be different color and so forth. And also different Taobao sellers may also have different service attached to the same brand product, right? This could be shipping, or could be other kind of, are they willing to negotiate price beyond the marketplace, for example, and how friendly they are dealing with customer questions. There are a lot of dimensions that the Taobao sellers could differ from each other. That's probably make the Taobao sellers sort of different from the Flagship seller or the Tmall seller. And we see that phenomena for both prominent and non-prominent brands. And then if we move to this dummy, this is very interesting. This is dummy just showing whether your brand, the brand that you're selling, has a Flagship entry. Okay, it's just a 1 or 0. And you can see that it has a negative impact on the Taobao sellers, but has a positive impact on the Tmall sellers. So this means having a Flagship store from the brand you are selling is actually going to sort of help you if you are a Tmall seller, okay? However, it's going to hurt you if you're a Taobao seller. And this probably makes sense because if you're thinking the Taobao sellers are individual, they're more likely to be unauthorized sellers. People may have more question of whether their products are authentic or not than having a Flagship store as a contrast. They're probably going to make people thinking, oh, maybe this is not going to be authentic, or most likely not going to be authentic, and I could buy the authentic somewhere else. So that could sort of depress the consumer perception for Taobao sellers, but enhance the consumer perception for Tmall sellers, because those are registered companies. They're more likely to be authorized sellers from the brand.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. And we see that for the non-prominent sellers brands as well. Yes.
Yeah, Ginger.
Some question?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm trying to reconcile. So I think I get what you're saying, but one thing puzzles me. These tables seem to say consumers may go to the Flagship store to look across the broad array of products, but they might go to Tmall in order to buy it because they can get a cheaper price as long as they know it's authentic. Right?
Yep.
I could read it this way. Is that
yep.
accurate? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. Except that, okay, so that
it could be one mechanism of doing this.
Yeah, but it's only one mechanism, yeah. And so, and then what I don't understand is, maybe I remember that you showed us that the quantity sold on the Flagship store was quite substantial in comparison to Tmall, right?
Yep.
So if that mechanism I just described was operating, you might have thought you'd get a lot of migration of buyer away from the flagship, but apparently not. So so that's the tension I'm puzzled by.
Yeah. Well, what I'm not showing you is the product fixed effects. And the product fixed effects for Flagship store actually turns out to be much larger than the product fixed effects for other sellers. So this is the intercept in the utility function. So people may overall thinking the Flagship store is much higher quality than all the other sellers. And that could explain the large sales.
Gotcha. Got it. Thank you. Perfect.
Yep. Okay, and the role here, and finally the role here is the AR1 process in the C term, okay? And we do see a lot of time dependency of those unobserved attributes, so it's important to control for them. And we have some robustness checks allowing higher order of rows, and the results are relatively robust. Okay, so let me move on. Okay, so I told you before that our year-month fixed effects actually could capture the potential market expanding effect from Flagship entry. So we need to sort of unpack that a little bit, okay? So we do that by defining the demand residual. So you can think of the demand residual, it's just the dependent variable minus the estimates I just showed you in the last slide. So what's left in that residual is product fixed effects and year-month fixed effects. And in order to decompose that year-month fixed effects into seasonality and the overall changes because of Flagship entry, we so in this regression, we basically regress the residuals on a bunch of things, okay? And we still keep the month fixed effects. That's just for the seasonality, okay? And then we have the number of Flagship prominent stores and the number of non-prominent Flagship stores. So that's both variables are kind of just changing and increasing over time, okay? And we regress the residual on those variables. So the positive coefficient on those variables could be interpreted as you increase this number of Flagship stores on the marketplace, then people's view about this particular type of brand and particular channel may be increasing or decreasing. Okay, so this would capture the sort of like the cross-brand overall perception changes. So if we look at this coefficient, the number of Flagship store from prominent brand, it has a negative impact on Taobao and positive on Tmall and almost zero effect on other Flagship stores. So this is sort of saying that's maybe as people see more and more Flagship stores from prominent brand on this marketplace, they would increase their perception on the Tmall sellers because they're likely to be authorized sellers. They're going to continue downgrade their perception on the Taobao sellers because they sort of probably more likely to think the Taobao sellers are unauthorized sellers. And you see that phenomena for prominent brand. And we could also have the cross effect, right? You could have the number of Flagship store from prominent brand change people's perception about non-prominent brands in different sellers. So this is why this table sort of become big. It's trying to capture those cross and within type of brands effects. Okay, so all these information will be used later on in the counterfactual simulation. Okay, so let me continue. Okay, so yeah, I only have 20 minutes left. I'm going to speed up a little bit, okay? So from those demand estimates, we can calculate the price elasticity, okay? And here we're showing the own price elasticity, and here we're showing the group elasticity, both within the same type and cross type. And you can see that the own price elasticity is negative. Okay, that's a good thing, and that's coming from the negative coefficient on price. However, we do observe the elasticity for Taobao to be quite small, it's even smaller than a -1. okay? And so we're going to put that aside and we'll try to explain that later on. And then if you look at the cross-group elasticity, you basically have negative within the same type and channel, okay? And then positive everywhere else, okay? And that seems intuitive, okay? And finally, if you look at the price elasticity actually turns out to be the highest for flagship stores than for other type of sellers. So let's come back to the question of why we even have inelastic demand for Taobao sellers. We don't have a good explanation. Okay, these are the potential explanations. Taobao price is much lower typically, and their products plus service may be less standardized. And they may face a tighter quantity constraint. Like, okay, I'm happy to lower the price for this particular brand, for this particular product, but I'm not the authorized seller. I end up having a very limited quantity on that. So even if I lower the price, I just cannot have a lot of sales out of it because of the capacity constraint. And probably for that reason as well, the Taobao sellers may use a prominent brand's limited supply item as a loss leader, right? They may say, okay, I'm going to lower the price on this one. I'm not going to lose too much revenue on that, but it's a good advertising for me because I have a limited supply. So all these could happen and could result in we have less quantity response to some price changes in Taobao sellers. Exactly which one is the one working here, we don't know. Okay, so let me move on. So we were so surprised about the inelastic demand by Taobao sellers. We went in the raw data to see how raw data look like. And the raw data seems to suggest, yeah, we do see sort of less elastic demand for Taobao than for Flagship. So I'm going to skip those graphs and move on to the supply side. I'm really going to speed through the supply side. Hopefully it's intuitive to you. So the supply side is pretty similar to the BLP framework we allow the Taobao and Tmall sellers to maximize their static profit as the margin times the quantity they sold. But for flagship stores, we allow them to take into account their impact on Tmall sellers or on Taobao sellers by allowing some conduct parameter here. We basically sort of allow them to say maybe they hate unauthorized sellers on Taobao, so they actually want to use their price to depress their profit, or they may think the Tmall sellers are authorized sellers. They got some wholesale revenue from them, so they want to take into account the impact of the flagship's price on them. So that would have some sort of, basically these are the ways that they take into account the profits of other sellers, okay? And we're going to estimate those conduct parameters. And then from those, we can derive the first order condition from the supply side, and the conduct parameters just come in by saying that's the price of the flagship store is going to take into account its implication on the Taobao and Tmall sellers to the extent of those conduct parameters described. Okay, so let me move on. So that's the estimates from the supply side. I just want to highlight a few things here. These are the conduct parameters. They all turns out very close to 0. So that means the flagship store do not care how their action would impact other sellers on the marketplace, okay? And we find the marginal cost for flagship store is much, much higher than the marginal cost for Tmall and Taobao sellers, okay? And that's true for both prominent and non-prominent sellers. And we have negative costs here for Taobao just because we had inelastic demand from our demand estimation, and we have to deal with it somewhat because otherwise we cannot predict the price from the counterfactuals. So we end up using a reduced form price equation to estimate the Taobao's pricing decision rather than using the first order condition from the demand system. And that's just for Taobao because of their demand is inelastic. Okay. So, yes.
One question. So
yes.
These estimates would seem to imply that the behavior on the flagship mall isn't very profitable for a brand, even if it's very prominent. But it could imply that the prominent brands are using the flagships to sell large quantities, but make themselves more prominent and then use the prominence somewhere else.
I hear what you're saying. Actually, as I will show in the counterfactual, it's the flagship store turns out to be very profitable. And maybe the number I show you is misleading because of normalization, that we're not allowed to show the actual marginal cost. It's normalized.
Normalized, and also you're not showing, so what's going to be is the large quantities, but with small margins, but if the quantities are enormous, it still makes it profitable. Is that?
Well, the margin, I mean, I don't know the exact magnitude comparison of the margins, but the margin is definitely positive for the flagship stores.
Okay.
Yeah, I will show you the profit.
Okay, got it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So in the counterfactual, we think about two situations. One is the baseline scenario where we just simulate one brand open a flagship store at the end of our data period, right? These are the brands that have not opened a flagship store, but according to our demand estimation, we can simulate what happened if they open a flagship store. Okay, and then the second scenario is, suppose we simulate such flagship entry, but at the same time put some restrictions on third-party sellers. Okay, we could restrict the number of Taobao sellers, we could restrict the number of Tmall sellers. So I'm going to show you different scenarios there. Okay, and exactly how we do the counterfactual is actually a little more complicated than the first glance. We take the model parameters from demand and supply. We simulate one entry at a time. We need to recompute everybody's equilibrium price given the new market structure. We're going to update the product fixed effects in light of the new entry. And this includes that we sort of assume the new flagship store has the same intercept as the average flagship store already in the market. It's also need to update the potential change of consumer perception because of this new entry. Okay, so we do all of that. And we also assume the marginal cost of the entering flagship store is the same as the average marginal cost of existing flagship store of the same type. Okay, and then we simulate the equilibrium market shares. Okay, so let me show you the simulation results for prominent brand. I'm showing you the average number per brand. We actually simulate this for every prominent brand without a flagship store yet. So this is just the average, okay? And everything is normalized here. And the normalization is done in this way. If you look at the price, this is normalized by the average price existing on the marketplace for this brand. Okay, if this brand already have Tmall sellers and Taobao sellers selling this brand, what's the quantity weighted average price? That's the normalization one. Okay, and then you can see that the entering flagship store on average would charge more than double the price. Okay, and then their quantity is normalized by the total quantity sold by other sellers for this brand before their entry. So you can see they are able to sell more than the total of all the other sellers selling before their entry. So that's very large quantity as well, okay? And their GMV is about 176% of the total GMV of other sellers before their entry on this brand. And their profit is about 38% of the other sellers before their entry. Okay, so I guess, Shane, you're right. That's because their cost is higher, their price is higher, so their profit is not as impressive as their quantity and GMV, but it's still positive. Okay, And then if you look at how this entry affects incumbent, both within the brand and other brands, you can see we have a massive negative impact on the sellers within the brand. So that means the Taobao sellers and Tmall sellers have to lower their price by a lot, okay? And still they're selling a lot less because of the flagship entry, okay? So they suffer large amount of loss in GMV and in profit. However, for other brands, they largely would have a positive impact. That's probably because the flagship entry itself has expanded the market. So they are buying this brand, they also buy other brands. So other brands within the same category actually benefit from having this flagship store entering into the marketplace. Putting everything together, if we ask, okay, how much is the extra consumer surplus out of this flagship entry? And on average, that turns out to be positive, okay? And this actually is a little sensitive to our demand estimation. When we put in more AR process, like instead of having AR1, when we have AR3, this number actually turns out to be negative. So thinking this as kind of sensitive results, it may or may not increase consumer surplus, okay? And that's because on one hand, it's increased the consumer choice. On the other hand, it charged much higher price than other sellers, okay? However, consumers may have good perception about the brands, so they're willing to pay for higher price. So then the consumer surplus is kind of an aggregate of all those effects, which could be positive or negative. From the GMV's perspective, this is for the platform, right? So on average, every new entry of a prominent brand flagship store actually increased the GMV by about 0.9% for the whole category. So that's pretty impressive lift of GMV for the platform, okay? So that's just the baseline simulation, and we see relative similar results for an entry of non-prominent brand, and they're just of slightly different magnitude, smaller magnitude typically. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So this is showing that what if we also put some seller restriction, okay? So the kind of restriction we're thinking, these are hypothetical, is we could ban all the Taobao sellers, we could ban all the Tmall sellers, or we can just keep the top 10% of sellers on both channels, okay? And the numbers sometimes become wild because there are some outlier brand, they have very few Taobao sellers selling even before the flagship entry. But when the flagship entered, according to our simulation, it picked up a huge amount of quantity. So that as if they're taking like how many 49 times of the GMV. But this is driven by some outlier brands who have very few presence before on the marketplace before they before the flagship entry. If you look at the average impact on consumer surplus and on GMV, they are more stable because those outlier brands typically do not have huge amount of traffic, so they do not contribute too much to the change of consumer surplus and GMV. So on average, we still see similar signs as before, but actually they are, if you look at a consumer surplus, they're of lower magnitude than the baseline scenario, which is understandable because now you're restricting consumers' choice set rather than expanding it, right? Because you're sort of chase away other sellers of the flagship entry. The GMV is kind of a more interesting story. This actually is bigger than previously, and this is bigger, but this is equal to before. So the impact seems like the bundle of having a flagship entry and restrict other sellers seems to have kind of a mixed effects on the GMV. It could increase the GMV even for the platform just because the flagship store now have so much GMV coming in and despite higher price, okay? However, it sort of cannibalized sales of other sellers, and because the cannibalization is so big, it probably does not hurt the platform even if those sellers do not exist. So we see those kind of mixture effect here. Okay, so let me show you some graph because these numbers may be too hard to read. Okay, so let me show you some graph just for the comparison of different scenarios here. So that's for non-prominent. I'm going to skip. Okay, so this is a graph we're trying to compare. Okay, we have a baseline, just a flagship entry. We also have more extended version, say the entry would come with some restriction on the sellers. How would those scenarios actually compare with each other distribution-wise in GMV? Okay, so this what this picture is showing you. The black one is the baseline. Okay, so the black one, this is for the baseline. Okay. And then the colored ones are the ones with all kinds of restrictions, okay? So you can see that the restrictions could sort of increase the GMV for the platform as compared to the baseline, or could decrease it, okay? It's unclear whether the platform would want to put such restriction or not for prominent brands, okay? In comparison, if we look at consumer surplus, if we look at the graph for consumer surplus, the consumer surplus seems to be unambiguously getting worse if you put more restrictions on sellers. Okay, so the GMV picture and the consumer surplus picture are actually quite different. And this is for prominent brands. If we do the same thing for the non-prominent brand, the non-prominent brand actually has a clearer picture. For non-prominent brand, the black line again is showing for the baseline here, right? The colored is for the restricted version. So it seems like for non-prominent brand, the flagship entry without restrictions generate more GMV than the restricted version, okay? And then if you look at consumer surplus, again, we have the fact that the baseline flagship entry without restriction would have a higher consumer surplus than without a restriction. So if you consider the fact that we have way more non-prominent brands than prominent brands, so that means overall we actually would have the flagship entry help the consumers most of the time. Okay, and that's because it's expand the consumers' choice set, it intensify the price competition, especially within the brand. It improved the consumer perception for both the entering brand, flagship store, as well as for the platform overall. So that have a market expanding effect and would benefit other brand, okay? And then putting restriction on other sellers at the same time of flagship entry actually would reduce consumer surplus. And we can see that the different sellers will have very different reaction to this flagship entry. The same brand sellers would be hurt, right, because of the cannibalization, but other brands may welcome the flagship store entry because of the market expansion effect. And then the platform most time would have a GMV increase from the flagship store, and that means revenue increase for the platform. So that's basically the story we have so far. I would like to hear any question you have.
Here, Ginger, here, I'll have one. Particularly your, like bullet point 3, the business team and market expansion effects. That's very interesting. You would think, I mean, that tension would be different when Alibaba first proposed flagship stores in comparison to when it was now 50% done and they had a lot of participation. So, so in other words, I have this intuition that I can't quite, but it seems like this fits your story, that once they got it above a certain size, or once they got a certain amount of participation, 30%, 50%, I'm not quite sure, some intuition, if you were a major brand, you had no choice. You better get yourself a flagship, precisely because otherwise you were depending all on your third-party sellers, and boy, was that going to be problematic. You might have benefited initially because things got bigger, but then you were going to lose out. Whereas early on, it's a little less clear to me how or how Alibaba gave incentives to the major brands to participate in the flagship store. Did you see the question?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think I agree to part of your arguments, but probably not entirely, because yeah, we can definitely actually estimate this, right? I mean, you're basically saying that the number of flagship stores existing on the marketplace may have a nonlinear and potentially concave impact on the overall perception of the platform.
Yeah,
we can definitely estimate that. But I'm not sure whether the later flagship store would have more or less incentive to join as a flagship, because other flagship stores actually have a market expanding effect on other sellers of that brand, right? So you can continue your wholesale model, so to speak, that still have authorized sellers on your on Tmall, and they enjoy the spillover from other flagships, right? So you could just enjoy the ride without having your flagship store. I don't know what's the cost of setting up a flagship store, but if you're following sort of other flagship stores, that's you're sort of foregoing the profit of the high price, high quantity, and high sales you could get by having your own flagship store.
Yeah,
so
that's very
I think the incentive might be more mixed.
Yes, I had an intuition, and listening to you, I realized that the market expansion effect would be larger at the moments early in the building of the flagship stores, but that may not be right, as for the reasons you're identifying. So, okay. That's it.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point, though. Yeah. I mean, I should also point to the limitation that our data is just for this platform, right? The same brand may have their own physical locations, selling their own brand somewhere else, or they may be selling in other online marketplaces. We're sort of ignoring that. Some of the sales increase could be cannibalizing of those other channels as well. And that will be considered by the brand.
Yeah, so we reached our time. I want to at least give everybody an opportunity to thank you, and then maybe a few people, if they want to have questions, we can hang out and ask you. But we at least want to do a proper, thanks for the presentation, and it was really excellent and really very thought-provoking. And then give opportunities to others that we can have like a smaller conversation among those who are interested.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoy the questions.